All right, good morning, all. This is Elder Harris. This is the quick, powerful, sharp study of the Gospel of John. This morning, we'll be covering John 11, verses 20 through 46. We went ahead and put this on live because it is not often that some of us are free to do this in the morning. If you'll remember, last week we talked about the first portion of John 11. And in the first portion of John 11, we found Jesus on the east side of the River Jordan because he had to get out of Judea. He had to get out of Judea because Jesus had openly confessed to be one with the Father and in the Father while the Father was in him. The unbelievers perceived that as blasphemy and attempted to stone him, that is to say, execute him right there on the spot. Jesus escaped to the eastern side of Jordan, the same spot or the same area where John the Baptist had once preached. And it is in that place where Jesus got word in the beginning of John 11 that one of his close friends was sick. Jesus was close to a family of siblings, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And Lazarus, the male of that sibling group, had fallen ill and so weak to the point where it was clear he was about to die. The end of our session last week had us finally come to the point where Jesus had explained some things to the disciples about Lazarus's death not being the end of it, and Lazarus having died wasn't going to be dead forever. Jesus decides to go to Bethany. Now, that covers basically the end of John 10 into the beginning of John 11, and that'll get us close to where we want to get started today. You got to remember that one of the things we learned in the beginning of John 11 was that Jesus put out that Lazarus's sickness was not unto death, but was for the glory of God. We covered last week that glory is the high praise, the approval, the high degree of honor that one puts on a subject. And so there was going to be an element of honor and approval that would be given to God whenever Lazarus is raised from the dead. But Jesus made that clear to his disciples, and he also made it clear to his disciples that there was an element of pleasure, an element of goodness that was going to come from this, because the disciples are now going to have the opportunity to know Jesus to a greater degree and have their faith grow from the point of knowing Jesus solely as a healer to knowing Jesus as a resurrector of the dead. Well, Jesus goes en route. He leaves where he is on the eastern side of Jordan. He takes the 1.5 to 2 mile trip over to the city of Bethany within the district of Judea to meet Mary and Martha. And this is the occasion on which I want to take a quick step off and talk about Mary and Martha and what we know about them at this point. Mary and Martha and the family, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, show up at least 3 times in our gospel record. And the first time we see them is in Luke 10, verses 38 through 42. And in that instance, we find that Martha has hosted Jesus, the traveling minister, the one that has an entourage of elders or disciples with him. Martha is hosting them in her home. And of course, Mary and Lazarus live there as well. And Martha is found in Luke 10, verses 38 through 42, to be hospitable to Jesus by being her hostess, but she also busied herself a lot with the hostess duties. And because of that, she was missing out on Jesus' teachings. On the other hand, you've got her sister Mary. Mary, in that instance, she greatly valued Jesus' teaching and frankly would rather sit at Jesus' feet than be busy doing hostess duties, making sure the food is together, everybody had drinks, checking the AC or the temperature. I know they didn't have those things, but these are hostess duties. And so Mary and Martha contrast in their response to Jesus. Martha was busy at work doing stuff, while Mary was settled, focused at Jesus' feet, listening to what he had to say. And we found from the passage in Luke 10, verses 38 through 42, that Jesus gave an assessment of those 2 responses. Jesus heard Martha complain because Martha was like, Mary's not helping, make her help. And Jesus told Martha that it's not good to be easily distracted. And Jesus also tells Martha that Mary actually made the better choice. Though less physically and evidently active, Mary was doing what God wanted her to do in that setting. And that thing that God wanted her to do would be listen to God's voice. So for us, Christians nowadays, we can take a lesson from that. We need to be able to tell the difference in between being busy for God and being in relation and in concert with what God wants to happen at the time. Being busy versus being obedient are not necessarily the same thing. We can take a look at ourselves and figure out if us building up his kingdom, because I've heard that a number of times, or us doing things that have us going back and forth consistently, but perhaps not spending quality time hearing the voice of God. We got to ask ourselves the question that many have asked: is this a good thing or is this a God thing? So that's Mary and Martha in Luke 10. That's the background we have on those two people. At this point in John 11, we've got Jesus en route to go see Mary and Martha. We have it clear that Lazarus has gone from the place of being ill or weak to dead. And in verse 19 of John 11, we see that Mary and Martha, they have a house full of people. And they have a house full of people because the custom of that time for the Jews is that when an immediate family member would die, what they would do is they would do a thing called sitting Shiva. And to sit Shiva, it was a commemoration and a tradition where one sat for something like 7 days in the house of the dead person, the Shiva house. And what they would do is for 3 days, it'd just be family. And they would sit in solemnness and they would mourn and they would reflect on the deceased person. But after that third day, at that point, you had folks that would come from all around the Jewish community to come and help you essentially mourn, or they would come to support and console you in your bereavement. So this is what Mary and Martha are doing. Verses 19 through 20 make it clear that many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning the death of their brother. And so this is the type of tradition that's being enacted and celebrated there. We have, by the time we see verse 20, Mary and Martha are left in the house. They're the bereaved, the bereft. They're in the house. They are commemorating the death of their brother. They're mourning. It's a sad place to be. But in verse 20, we see that Martha has heard that Jesus is en route, and Martha takes off and leaves the house. So that means Mary's the only family member there with a house full of folks that have come to sit Shiva with her. Martha, ever the activist, heard that Jesus was en route. She takes off to go see him. And Martha is on the move. She's running after a solution. This is characteristic of the way Martha is. We got to remember, I just told you, in a past instance, when Jesus came to visit their home and Martha was hosting, Mary was seated. Here we see again, Mary sitting at the house during the funeral time frame, the Shiva time frame of Lazarus's death, and Martha has taken off. So verses 21 through 22 of John 11 record Martha's words when she catches up with Jesus, or when she finds Jesus en route to her city, her village. Martha in verse 21 immediately starts to express two bits of faith, two types of faith that she had. And they may also be indicative of her mindset, because you can imagine if you have a close family friend, Jesus, that is a healer and that can fix supernatural problems like the death of a loved one or the illness and closest to death of a loved one. There are certain things that are continuously moving in her mind. And perhaps one of those was, if he was just here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. And so that's what comes out of Martha's mouth. And by the time we get to verse 21, Martha says in verse 21, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother, he wouldn't have died. And that is an expression of the faith that she had in the past when Lazarus was alive and nearing death. And so Martha expresses her past faith by saying, if you were here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. But Martha also expresses present or right now faith, because she says, but I know, that's present tense, that even now, present tense, whatever you ask of God, he'll give it to you. And so Martha, when she catches up with Jesus, her speech to him are expressions of faith about her past faith and the faith that is still existing in that moment. And Jesus' response in verses 23 through 24 are responses to her expressions of faith. It's a prophetic word, though, because Martha doesn't know this. And Jesus tells her that her brother is going to rise again. Martha, after hearing Jesus' prophetic word, the prophetic word that came after her expressions of faith in Jesus and what he could do, she heard Jesus' prophetic word, and It is disappointing that her mind, her knowledge level, her theology, her belief system, it misinterpreted what Jesus said. Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And Martha heard, your brother will rise again later. You see, here we have Martha, she's talking to Jesus and gets a prophetic word about what's about to happen. And because all she knows is the theological principles that she's been taught, she can't quite grasp the immediate and right now-ish nature of Jesus's words. Your brother is going to rise again. Like I said, in verse 24, she says she knows certain things. That is to say, her knowledge base was only in a certain place to where she could not receive the immediate miracle that was going to take place verses later. Jesus said, your brother will rise again. And Martha says, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So her knowledge base messed it up. She got a prophetic word from Jesus, and what she knew, sadly, was inadequate enough to receive the gravity of what Jesus said. Now, we all know Lazarus is going to get resurrected. But Martha at the time, she wasn't able to perceive that. And so she had an incorrect understanding of what was happening. So Jesus has to go in and correct Martha's understanding of his own words. Jesus, he does this by granting Martha in verses 25 through 26 of John 11, he grants her divine revelation of who she is. And so this is profound. Martha comes through with these professions of faith, or both past and current faith. And Martha is getting a prophetic word from Jesus, and now she's about to get a divine revelation of who Jesus is. I was speaking with a pastor. I think it was maybe 2 days ago. It was Pastor Ward of Wilmington, North Carolina. And he reminded me that it takes God to reveal himself. You don't get revelation of God without God allowing that revelation to happen. Here, Martha is getting the divine revelation of Jesus and his effect and his person and his power. Jesus tells Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. And Jesus tells her this, gives her this revelation of who he is, so that she can better frame the words that have already come out of Jesus' mouth. Jesus also says, in clarifying that he is the revelation of the life, Jesus says that anyone that believes in me, this is anyone that believes in Jesus, even if they've died physically, they're going to become alive in the future. John 11, verses 25 through 26. And Jesus also clarifies, as the resurrection and the life, that anyone that believes in Jesus is therefore currently alive spiritually and will never die spiritually. And so Jesus has given Martha this revelation of who he is and how things work when a person believes in him. Jesus has told Martha, Jesus is the resurrection and life. He's told Martha, even those that have died physically, if they believe in Jesus, they'll come alive in the future. And Jesus told Martha, as the resurrection and the life, that those that believe in Jesus are currently alive spiritually and will never die, referring to eternal life. After this revelation, Jesus immediately questions Martha to find out if she believes the words that he's just spoken. He asks her if she believed this grand revelation that had just been made apparent to her. Jesus' words are, believest thou this? That's to say, do you believe this? You believe what I'm saying? Verse 27 through 28 has Martha's response that is spectacular in a way, but also disappointing in a way. Verses 27 through 28 have Martha really explain her response to this resurrection and life claim of Jesus, because Jesus is both. And Martha's response is kind of a four-part response. First, in verse 27, we see Martha say, yes, Lord, or yea, Lord. And this is a willing reception and obedience to the lordship, that is to say, the rulership of Jesus. The second part of Martha's response is that she says she believes certain things. Martha does believe that Jesus is the Messiah, what we often call Christ. And this belief that God has chosen and anointed Jesus. So she believes that. Martha also expresses that she believes that Jesus is the Son of God, which should come into the world. That is to say, the prophesied heavenly Son of the living God that has been sent into the earth realm. Martha is expressing that she believes in God's purpose expressed in Jesus and God's plan expressed in Jesus. And so she believes in all this. And this is a grand expression of her belief, of her faith. So Martha is one with faith for sure, but Martha's faith has its limits. Let's talk about Martha's limit. Well, Jesus' question was, do you believe what I just told you about me being the resurrection and the life, and people that were physically dead once coming alive, and as the resurrection and the life, that those that are spiritually alive will never die? Jesus said, do you believe this? And her response was a reference to other stuff, a reference to Jesus' lordship. She said, yes, Lord. Reference to Jesus' messiahship. She says, you're the Christ. A reference to Jesus' godhood. She says, I believe you're the Son of God. But Martha did not indicate specifically that she believed that Jesus was a resurrector. At this point, there was opportunity for her faith to grow there in the same way that the disciples' faith would grow once they found out that Jesus was a raiser of the dead. After this interaction, Martha heads back and runs back to the house. In verse 28, we find that Martha gets back into the Shiva house. She goes to Mary, her sister, and delivers a personal invite from Jesus to her and said, the teacher is here and he's calling for you. And so the next part of this narrative is what happens when Mary takes off and now leaves the Shiva house. Now she leaves the place of mourning, the place where there's a not quite a repast, but something like a repast, a time where everyone's in the house helping her mourn. Verse 28 through 31, or verses 28 through 31, have Mary doing what was expected. Sitting Shiva as the community comes to help her, and her mysteriously missing sister has come back to tell her that Jesus is up the road and he's calling for you. So Mary doing what we would expect of one that is perhaps a little bit more emotional, perhaps a little bit more relationally apt to things. She hears that Jesus is here and he's near. She takes off, she runs. Well, because Mary is still sitting Shiva, and people, as they're looking at the two sisters, know that Martha is kind of, the one that's going to be busy, the one's going to be active, but Mary may be a little bit more tender and emotional. Mary's taking off meant the people that were in the house, they taken off with her, because everyone wants to be here to support them, but they definitely want to support Mary. And so Mary takes off, and the folks assume that Mary is taken off to go back to the cemetery where they had already buried Lazarus. Many of us have been in funeral settings and situations, and we know you kind of got to be prepared for things to go left sometimes. At any point, somebody could have an outbreak or a breakdown because it's an emotionally charged environment. Here, Mary takes off. All those that have come to help her mourn assume, oh, she's taken off to go and cry and weep at the tomb of Lazarus. So Mary eventually finds Jesus in verse 30, and Mary finds Jesus in the same spot that Martha found Jesus. And so from here, it would appear that while Jesus had left where he was on the east side of Jordan and headed in the direction of the family home, Jesus had not intended to go all the way to the family home, because Mary, who left and took off after Martha, found Jesus in the same spot as Martha found him. And so it would appear that Jesus came to the site of Lazarus's body, that is to say, the cemetery near the family home, and perhaps didn't intend to visit the actual home where Lazarus died. Verse 31 has it clear that a lot of the folks that, like I said, a lot of the folks that came to visit Mary, they followed her as Mary ran out of the house to go meet Jesus. And in verse 32, Mary has some words for Jesus that are recorded. Verse 32 has some of the same words coming out of Mary's mouth as the words that came out of Martha's mouth. Martha gave those two expressions of faith, faith in Jesus' past ability, or the past faith that Martha had, and Martha also had a now faith, a current and present faith. Mary shows up and sees Jesus, and Mary says the same things that Martha said to express her faith in what Jesus could have done prior to Lazarus dying. Mary shows up, and in verse 32, it says, when she saw him, she fell down at his feet and said unto him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother had not died. Now, I want us to not glaze over this too fast. The first action that Mary does after seeing and locating Jesus, the help here is an act of worship. Remember, in our Bibles, a lot of times where we see the word worship, what we're looking at is a form of the concept bow down, be at the feet of someone. That's many times what worship means here. And so Mary, true to form, as soon as she sees Jesus, she fell down at his feet. Now you may ask the question, why am I saying true to form? Why are you saying Mary is always at Jesus' feet? Because the biblical record that we have of Mary, it oftentimes places her at Jesus' feet. In Luke 10, verses 38 through 42, remember, Martha was busy hosting and making sure all the guests and the preachers and the listeners were comfortable and in a good state of affairs. But it was Mary who was at Jesus' feet listening. Here in this narrative, John 11, we've got this tragedy that's occurred. Lazarus has died. Mary's brother is dead. They are in the process of mourning his death. And Mary takes off to go find Jesus. And on sight, what she does is she puts herself at his feet. Later on, if you'll keep reading, and we will, John 12, we have Mary as the one that again at Jesus' feet, she breaks open expensive perfume and wipes down Jesus' hair from the feet of Jesus. And so Mary has a habit of having a stance of worship, an attitude of worship, a place where when she sees Jesus, she wants to be at his feet. And this instance is no different. Mary, the habitual worshiper, has used the same words from her worship stance, her being at Jesus' feet stance, to express that she had past faith. Jesus, she knew, could have healed Lazarus before he died, and he didn't have to die. Verse 32, it says just exactly what she said, or just exactly what Mary said. If you had been here, my brother had not died. He didn't have to die. But while Martha was able to move beyond the past faith expression and speak to a right now faith expression, Mary wasn't able to do that. Mary could only say that she had faith when Lazarus was alive, that he could be healed. Mary could only express past faith. And after that, the record that we have is that all Mary had was grief. All she could do was cry. And we don't look down on Mary for that. Different folks are going to respond to things different places. If we've learned anything, it is that people's responses are going to vary from person to person. And frankly, people's faith level varies from person to person. Mary, in verse 33, who's regarded as the tenderer and more emotional, potentially more fragile of the two sisters, here we see her weeping, and weeping is something that contributes to a certain response from Jesus. Mary's weeping really got to Jesus. I mean, obviously, there was a problem. There was disappointment when Jesus shows up. Martha shows up. Martha's disappointed, but she expresses faith. But when Mary showed up, Mary's weeping took the cake. It took the emotionally charged environment of Lazarus' death. From here, it took it up a couple of notches. Mary not only showed up crying, but she brought with her, if you remember, all those mourners that had come to her house to help her mourn. And so Mary brings with her a crowd of folks that are crying. And if you've ever heard a Middle Eastern woman like this Mary cry, it's not a couple of tears falling. It is a loud wailing, like a wailing that could almost cut the audible atmosphere. Like from a ways away, you would hear them like, what is that? It's something that gives you chills because it is a very effective cry. There may have been some of that characteristic yodel type action happening, and it was an out loud wailing cry. All this contributed to this type of environment, and this environment, it affected Jesus. Mary was weeping in such a way with the concert of all these mourners that accompanied her that it deeply troubled Jesus. Verses 33 through 35 record that part of Jesus' involvement where he became deeply troubled. I mean, this picture, like I said, was emotionally charged. It was rough. It was at the cemetery, and these people were unleashing profound sorrow here. And it says that Jesus, he groaned in the spirit. That's verse 33 of John 11. The word picture attached to the word groan, it conveys agitation, irritation, intense concern, like almost to the point of anger. Like it has you, on edge. Like it's very bothersome. It has you extremely uneasy, almost mad, almost indignant. And the Bible also says that Jesus was also troubled. Troubled here conveys the idea that Jesus was stirred up, like disturbed and distressed. I mean, this environment affected him the way it would any of us, because Jesus is human. He's a human. He's not compassionless. He is compassionate. He loves these people, and that's already documented here. And Mary shows up with this tremendous amount of grief. These mourners show up with this tremendous amount of grief, compiled with the idea that his close friend has passed, and people don't understand that Lazarus is going to get up again. All this gets to Jesus, and out of Jesus's irritated, agitated, distressed, and disturbed, indignant a demeanor, Jesus starts asking, where's the body? What tomb is he in? Where have ye laid him? That's what Jesus is asking. Where is he? Jesus wants to know, where's the body? And the intensity that I'm handing to you right now could possibly be comparable to that of Jesus, because he's on edge. He's irritated. This environment has gotten to him. So Jesus asked the question, where is he? And after verse 34, when Jesus asked the question, where is the body? Verse 35 documents the shortest verse in Scripture. It says, Jesus wept. Now, let me check my time here. I think I'll say this. I had a question come through earlier. Why did Jesus weep? There are a number of theories. A lot of people try to take in the environment and put forth some hypotheses with regard to why Jesus wept. But there was a lot of stuff going on. You and I might have cried if we were there. It was intense. It was a family of close people and close friends and closeness, and just a lot of people in an environment of crying and weeping and mourning for what they thought was a loss. In between verse 34 and 35, we see that something happened where Jesus wept. It could have been, and I'll just throw some ideas out there. It could have been that in between verses 34 and 35, Jesus asked, where's the body? And they showed him the tomb. And as you can imagine, things are different when you know someone's dead and when you see their casket. When you know someone is passed on and when you see their grave, their tombstone. When you see their tomb, things get different. It becomes a little bit more difficult to hold in your emotions, and those tear ducts get to going a little bit haywire. And so Jesus's tear ducts went a little bit haywire. Go ahead and throw into this mix that disciples have not yet come to the place of faith and belief to understand that Jesus is a raiser of the dead. So there's unbelief. That could be bothering Jesus at this point. We've got people mourning and frankly questioning Jesus' decision not to show up earlier. And so there's that hurt attached to it there. There's plenty for Jesus to be bothered, troubled, indignant, irritated, agitated about, for him to weep. And when we get to verses 36 through 40, we get a look at the public opinion and the practical consideration. Verse 36 through 37 tells us about the public opinion. There are folks that came to mourn with Mary and Martha, and they took notice to Jesus crying. And their thought was, man, look how much Jesus loved this guy. They were finally enlightened with regard to Jesus's personal relationship with his family, how much Jesus loved them. Jesus wasn't just a healer for hire. He actually loved these people. He wasn't just a traveling preacher that was after preaching engagements to get some money. Jesus showed up to this family's mourning place because he loved them, and he loved the one that was thought to have passed on. And so the people saw that, and part of that group of people in verses 36 through 37 began to question, presumably out loud, why Jesus didn't show up sooner. Because if you loved him, is what they're saying, and they're looking at Jesus, they're like, but you're a healer. You just healed a guy that was blind from birth. No one has ever done it. That was unprecedented. And you have a healing ministry that's known throughout this entire sector, like through 3 and 4 different districts. Why didn't you just show up earlier? And so Jesus is now having his ministry decisions questioned by what some may call the peanut gallery. Jesus is having his obedience to God questioned and called up for a type of review by folks that are onlookers. And as you can imagine, anybody trying to obey God is to a degree hurt by that whenever people that are over there and people that are over here start to look at you and be like, why didn't you do different? You could have got a different result if you did a different thing. I don't understand why you're being obedient to God in that way. It doesn't make sense to me. You should have did it the way I'm thinking you should have did it. Well, Jesus is having to deal with that. They're asking, if you love him so much, why didn't you just heal him before he died? Well, Jesus again groans in verse 38. He groans in his spirit, again, irritated, agitated, because Jesus can hear this. Therefore, Jesus, he groaned again in himself. And after this, these comments from the peanut gallery on how Jesus should administer his healing and ministry practices, Jesus sees the stone is in the way, and Jesus makes a call. He's like, move the stone out of the way. And the practical, task-oriented, quick to point out problems person called Martha points out a problem with Jesus' strategy. Martha is quick to remind Jesus. She doesn't know if Pastor Jesus at the time has become so overcome with grief that he's not thinking clearly, but she's going to speak up. She says, Jesus, we can't do that. It stinks. It's been 4 days since he's been buried. Palestine, Jerusalem, Bethany, that whole area, it is muggy and it is hot. This body is about to stink something terrible. You don't want to do that. And Jesus' response to practical, reasonable Mary was that she needs to understand some things. Martha, forgive me, it is Martha who said that. Martha is thinking in the natural realm, in the physical realm, and in that realm, it makes sense, but Jesus is about to speak to her so that she sees some things in a more spiritual light. Jesus reminds Martha that her belief in him, her belief in Jesus, would result in seeing the glory of God, because that's what Jesus told Martha. In verse 27, Jesus told Martha before she left to go get her sister Mary, verse 27, I'll read it. Jesus said that if he believes it, he's going to see the glory of God. And so Jesus had a reminder of this because Jesus at this point is calling on her confession. Verse 27, Martha had already confessed that Jesus is both the Christ and the Son of God. And so right now that confession is being challenged. If she really believes what she says she believes, then Martha is going to have to allow this to happen so that her faith is about to get this growth, get these legs. Remember way back, and I had one of those verses off, in verse 4 of John 11. Verse 4 is when Jesus passed word that Lazarus' sickness was not to death, but that the Son of God might be glorified and that God would get the glory. Jesus is reminding Martha of what he's already said. Jesus is calling on Martha's confession of faith, that Jesus is both the Christ and the Son of God, because at this point, now that's being put to the test, when a stone is about to be rolled away from the tomb of her dead brother. So Jesus has the stone rolled away. And when we get to verses 41 through 42, we have Jesus' prayer to God the Father in heaven. Now, a number of folks think that this recorded prayer is not the first time Jesus prayed to God the Father regarding Lazarus' raising from the dead. Verses 41 through 42 have Jesus making a clear recipient or outlining a clear recipient to his prayer. Even Jesus prayed to the Father in heaven. And so the recipient of Jesus' prayer, the addressee of Jesus' prayer, is God's Father in heaven. Jesus' prayer included thanksgiving. Verse 41 of John 11 has Jesus saying, Father, I thank thee that you've heard me. And so Jesus' prayer includes thanksgiving. It includes a clear recipient. But that thanksgiving is Jesus thanking the Father for already having heard Jesus' request. And this exhibits faith that the Father in heaven already knows what's needed and what's going on. Jesus' prayer to the Father in heaven, it also includes knowledge about the Father. I mean, you should know that if you want to pray to the Lord and expect a level of response from God in heaven, you should know some things about God in heaven, because this is about a relational thing. If you don't know a lot about a person, your relationship is not very strong. Jesus had an extremely, the strongest relationship with God the Father. And so Jesus's prayer included knowledge about the Father. Jesus already knew that the Father in heaven hears him every time he prays. Every time. That means every past, present, future prayer, Jesus knew that the Father in heaven would hear him. Jesus says in verse 42 of John 11, and I knew that thou hearest me always. And next, as part of Jesus' prayer, Jesus is vulnerable and declares his motives. Basically, Jesus tells God the Father, this is why I'm doing this. Jesus declares his motive in telling the Father that his spoken words are spoken so that those that are watching will finally believe that the Father sent Jesus. This exhibits Jesus' efforts to reveal to humanity what Jesus and the Father already know, that God sent Jesus. Jesus in the end of verse 42 of John 11 says, but because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. So after Jesus prays to God the Father in heaven, he prays out loud, but he's not quite yelling. At this point, Jesus is about to turn his volume up, because Jesus from outside of the tomb of a dead Lazarus is going to have his voice heard inside that tomb that has been uncovered. Verses 43 through 44 has Jesus yelling, and what he says is a very specific instruction, two parts. Jesus calls Lazarus out by name, and Jesus gives Lazarus specific instruction. Jesus says, Lazarus, come forth. Now, Jesus, God walking among us, the resurrection and the life, has called Lazarus out of both death and decomposition. 4 days, decomposition is set in. And Lazarus starts walking forward out of the tomb. When Lazarus walks forth out of this tomb, that is to say, the Lazarus that was dead minutes earlier, but responds in his death place from being dead, as someone would say, a doornail or a doorknob, I don't know how the expression goes, laying there, put down, canceled out, scratched off the rolls, obituary currently being written so it can be published later. He's been wrapped up, put over in a corner. It's a done deal. Lazarus has come forward at Jesus' word, been called out. And what we're looking at is the record where Jesus calls Lazarus forth from death to life, but Lazarus has come forth as is. That means Lazarus was still dressed as if he were dead. What does that mean? That means that Lazarus' hands were bound, meaning he couldn't serve or manipulate things well. Lazarus' feet were bound, meaning he couldn't walk or move very well. And his face was bound. And as you can imagine, if your face is bound up with a cloth napkin or some sort of a mummification dressing, you're not going to be able to see very well. And so there was a boundedness that was attached to Lazarus's death dress. And Lazarus came forth with all these things on him. Jesus, having done a supernatural thing, unprecedented, unthinkable by so many, now orders that the onlookers and the witnesses do the rest. That means the witnesses had to get close to a body that was once dead and is now walking around, and they had to go to work. Jesus commands that these witnesses, these onlookers, that they loose Lazarus from being bound like a dead person. So though no longer dead, Lazarus was dressed and bound as if he were dead. And Jesus, having done the supernatural, he commands the onlookers to get in there and do what can be done in the natural. That is, take off his grave clothes. Jesus gives two commands to the onlookers. He says, loose him and let him go. Let him go from this cemetery, this place of death, this place of boundedness and shackled to the bondage, the death reality here. And Jesus wants them to give him liberty. So many have looked at and they've called this account didactic for, or they've reflected on this account as a good for teaching, is because this can be looked at as a figurative, a figure of what one accepting Christ is like. Because when one accepts Christ for the first time, they're called from a death place, a dead place, into the place of being alive, just like Lazarus. And like Lazarus, Dr. Elmer Towns, in a book called A Journey Through the New Testament, he would put that those that are brought into life, they have hindered service. because they have bound hands. They have hindered walking, hard for them to walk in Christ because they got bound feet, and they have hindered vision or things that they can't see. Their perspective is off. Just like Lazarus had a bound face and couldn't see so well. You see, after one is brought from death to life, the witnesses, the Christian community surrounding that person may well have to unbind a new convert from the remnants of their old life and escort them into their new life in Christian liberty. Give it some thought. It's got some merit to it. Finally, we get to verses 45 through 46, our last two verses here. Lazarus has been raised from the dead. As you can imagine, there's shock, there's awe. People are, and I'll say this, creeped out, trying to figure out what happens. But in that, they see that this is undoable. And in that seeing that this is undoable, no one has ever done anything like this before, it forces or is enough for many, and I mean many, to begin to believe in Jesus. Who else could do this but the Son of God? The party of folks that originally came to mourn with Mary and Martha, they came to sit Shiva with them, had largely become believers at that event right there. And you got to remember, Bethany as a village is not far from the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem, the geographical worship center of the Jewish faith, the place where all the religious authority tended to frequent, if not reside, the place where Jesus's warrants, the bounties that were on Jesus' head, the place where they emitted, the place where they started, where they originated. People came from that region to come and mourn with Mary and Martha, and now they're becoming believers in Jesus because with their own eyes, they saw the one that was dead come into life. Well, they saw what was impossible done. And so they believed on Jesus. They saw a man that was once sick, dead, and buried come back. He was sick and dead and buried. He was buried for the better part of a week, at least 4 days. But he came back and he was resurrected, good as new. And while there were a lot of believers in this particular crowd, some of the witnesses, whether they were unwilling to believe what Jesus said, regardless of this insurmountable evidence of Lazarus coming alive, or whether they had allegiances, loyalty to men, loyalty to religion, whether it's any of those cases, they went back to Jerusalem and told Jesus' opposition, the Pharisees, what had happened there. And in effect, they added a fuel to the fire. They essentially made the plot to kill Jesus, they made it more of a front burner type ordeal, or something that would take higher and higher priority on their list of things to accomplish. We'll talk about that next week. All right, so we've covered today verses 20 through 46 of John 11. Next week, we'll finish up John 11. I'm going to pray now, and then we will carry on with the rest of the week. Heavenly Father, thank you for your grace and your mercy. Thank you for being the resurrection and the life. Thank you for working with us and those of us that have differing levels of faith. Thank you for doing what is necessary for us to grow from faith to faith. Thank you for bringing us from death into life. Thank you for being one that is not untouched with our problems, not untouched with our infirmities, but has compassion on us. We thank you so much for your love and your relationship that you've allowed to come forth in between you and us. We ask that you would continue to reveal yourself to us the way you revealed yourself to Martha, Mary, the entire crowd there. Continue to show yourself strong in our behalf. We thank you and we trust you that regardless of how bad things look, your purpose is the God thing. We thank you so much for that. We ask that any of those that are listening to this video that have not set and committed themselves to you would come to the place of belief, that they would meet laborers sent into your harvest that would explain your person, your action, your love, and your gift. We thank you for this even now. In Jesus' name we pray. Thank God and amen.